Let me tell you something that's deeply uncomfortable, something that many people would rather not think about. Relationships, marriages, these are not fairy tales. They are crucibles. They are psychological battlegrounds where the truth of your character is revealed, often brutally. And in far too many cases, we see corrosive frappel classum. And in far too many cases, we see something tragic, something corrosive, a marriage where one partner, often the husband, becomes consumed by narcissism. He stops seeing his wife as a person, a living, breathing soul, and instead begins to treat her as an accessory, a mirror reflecting his own fragile ego. Now, this is not just a moral failure, it's a psychological disaster. Because when a man refuses to do certain essential things for his wife, when he refuses to act with humility, gratitude, and responsibility, he's not just destroying his marriage, he's dismantling his own potential. Plans of tonight, I want to walk you through 7 things, a precise list of what a narcissistic husband refuses to do for his wife. And as we go through them, I want you to remember, these aren't just relationship tips. They're moral imperatives, because the health of your marriage and the dignity of your soul depend on your willingness to confront the truth. A narcissistic husband's greatest act of refusal begins with his unwillingness to take responsibility for his own flaws. This isn't simply a matter of pride or arrogance. It's something much deeper and more destructive. Responsibility is the cornerstone of all psychological growth. To take responsibility means to admit that you are imperfect, that you are capable of error, and that your actions have consequences for yourself and for the people who depend on you. But the narcissistic husband cannot allow that thought to exist in his mind. For him, the idea of being wrong is intolerable. It threatens the fragile structure of self-importance that he has spent years constructing, so he avoids it at all costs. He builds excuses, rationalizations, and elaborate stories to protect himself from the painful truth that he is not, in fact, perfect. And when his wife points out a mistake, no matter how gently, he feels attacked. Her words are not received as a plea for connection or understanding, but as an assault on his identity. And so he retaliates, not necessarily with violence, but with blame, with sarcasm, with withdrawal. He may say, "You're too sensitive," or "You're imagining things," or "If you hadn't done this, I wouldn't have reacted that way." Each of these statements serves a single purpose: to shift responsibility away from himself and onto her. It's psychological sleight of hand, and it works, at least temporarily. It allows him to preserve his self-image, to keep believing that he is always right and that any problem in the relationship is her fault. But underneath that facade lies a man at war with himself, because somewhere, buried beneath layers of denial, he knows. He knows that he is not perfect. He knows that he is capable of cruelty, of laziness, of selfishness. And the deeper he hides from that truth, the more it eats away at him. That's the paradox of narcissism. The harder you try to appear flawless, the more fragile you become. A man who refuses to take responsibility for his flaws becomes enslaved by them. They govern his actions from the shadows, twisting his behavior and poisoning his relationships. Taking responsibility, by contrast, is an act of strength. It requires humility, the willingness to stand naked before the truth and admit, "I was wrong." It means confronting your own darkness, recognizing that you have the capacity to hurt others, and deciding to change. But change requires vulnerability, and vulnerability terrifies the narcissist. He equates vulnerability with weakness because he has never learned that it's the foundation of genuine strength. To say, "I made a mistake," is not to diminish yourself. It's to become more complete. Yet the narcissistic husband cannot comprehend this. In his mind, admitting fault means losing power, and power is the only thing that keeps his fragile sense of identity intact. So he clings to control. He micromanages conversations, rewrites history, and manipulates perception. He must always be the victim, the misunderstood genius, or the righteous hero. Everyone else becomes a supporting character in the narrative of his own self-importance. And his wife, his closest companion, becomes the most convenient scapegoat. Every disagreement turns into a courtroom drama where he is both the prosecutor and the judge. She might plead for understanding, for empathy, for fairness, but her words fall on deaf ears. Because to hear her would mean to face himself, and that is the one thing he cannot do. This refusal to take responsibility erodes the foundation of the relationship. Rarely, trust dies first because she begins to realize that no matter what happens, he will never own his part. Then comes resentment as she carries the emotional burden for two. And finally, silence, because speaking up becomes useless when the truth is always denied. The narcissistic husband believes he's winning these battles, but in truth, he's burning down his own house while standing inside it. Mind psychologically, his refusal is rooted in fear. Fear of inadequacy, fear of shame, fear of exposure. Shame is perhaps the most unbearable emotion for the narcissist because it punctures the illusion of superiority. When confronted with his shortcomings, instead of integrating that feedback into growth, he deflects it. This keeps him safe from immediate pain, but it also keeps him trapped in perpetual immaturity. He becomes emotionally frozen, unable to evolve, because evolution requires honest self-assessment. Lumdia, a responsible man, on the other hand, understands that flaws are not fatal. They are part of being human. When he fails, he learns. When he hurts someone, he apologizes. When he sees a pattern of destructive behavior, he works to change it. That process, imperfect, difficult, and ongoing, is what gives his life meaning. The narcissistic husband, by refusing that process, condemns himself to live without growth, without depth, and ultimately without love. His wife, in this dynamic, becomes the mirror he avoids. Every criticism she makes reflects a truth he refuses to acknowledge. Every request for emotional connection reveals the emptiness he's hiding from. So he breaks the mirror rather than face his reflection. But the truth doesn't disappear just because you refuse to see it. It waits, it festers, it manifests as frustration, alienation, and despair. Mendy, in the end, the refusal to take responsibility is not just a flaw, it's a form of self-betrayal. It's the abandonment of one's own potential for the sake of protecting an illusion. And in protecting that illusion, the narcissistic husband loses everything that could make him real. He refuses to genuinely listen and understand his wife's perspective, because true listening requires the surrender of ego, and that is something a narcissistic husband cannot tolerate. Listening, at its core, is an act of humility. It means accepting that another person's thoughts, emotions, and experiences are as valid and significant as your own. But for the narcissist, that equality feels intolerable. To listen would mean to make space for someone else's truth, and he lives in a world where only his truth matters. His voice must dominate every room, his opinions must be accepted without question, and his interpretation of reality must be final. Anything that challenges that dominance feels like chaos to him, so he shuts it down the only way he knows how, by refusing to truly hear. When his wife speaks, he does not listen to understand. He listens to respond, to defend, to counterattack. He hears her words not as communication, but as competition. If she expresses hurt, he interprets it as blame. If she shares an idea, he sees it as a threat. If she offers feedback, he perceives it as disrespect. Every interaction becomes a struggle for control, and so instead of connection, there is conflict. Instead of understanding, there is distortion. The conversation becomes an arena in which he must emerge victorious, even if it means destroying the very relationship he claims to protect. Planned over time, his wife learns that speaking her truth comes with a cost. The moment she begins to express herself honestly, she's met with defensiveness, ridicule, or cold silence. He might roll his eyes, interrupt her mid-sentence, or twist her words until she questions her own sanity. He might use phrases like, "You're overreacting," or "You always make everything about you," everything about you, or that's not what happened. These tactics are not random. They are tools of psychological control. They shift the focus away from her emotional experience and back onto his narrative. And gradually, her voice begins to fade. She starts to doubt the validity of her own feelings, and in doing so, she loses a piece of herself. For the narcissistic husband, this silence feels like victory. He believes he has restored order, that his dominance has been reaffirmed. But what he has really done is isolate himself. Genuine listening is the foundation of intimacy. It's how two people bridge the gap between their inner worlds. Without it, love cannot grow. It can only wither. When a man refuses to listen, he is not just closing his ears, he is closing his heart. He is declaring that the only reality that matters is his own, and that declaration makes him emotionally unreachable. What makes this refusal so insidious is that it often hides behind the illusion of engagement. A narcissistic husband might appear attentive, nodding or asking questions, but underneath, he's simply waiting for his turn to speak. Her allows to speak. His listening is strategic, not sincere. He absorbs just enough information to manipulate the conversation in his favor. He might even use his wife's vulnerabilities against her later, turning her words into ammunition during arguments. This behavior creates a cycle of distrust that corrodes the relationship from the inside. She stops confiding in him, and he interprets her withdrawal as coldness or disrespect, which then justifies his emotional distance even more. And the refusal to understand another person's perspective also reveals a profound emotional immaturity. To understand someone else, you must possess empathy. You must be able to imagine what it feels like to live inside their experience. But empathy requires a stable sense of self. The narcissistic husband's identity is too fragile for that. He cannot step outside himself without feeling disoriented or diminished. Other people's emotions confuse him because they remind him of the vulnerability he has spent his life denying. So he intellectualizes, criticizes, or invalidates those emotions instead of engaging with them. He might say things like, "You're too emotional," or "I don't have time for this drama," or "Why can't you just be logical?" These statements protect him from the discomfort of empathy, but they also rob him of its transformative power. And when his wife feels unheard, she begins to live in emotional solitude. She may still share a home, a bed, even a family with him, but she no longer shares her inner world. Her love turns cautious. Her honesty becomes filtered. She learns to measure her words, to anticipate his reactions, to minimize herself in the hope of maintaining peace. What was once a partnership becomes a performance, and he remains the only audience that matters. He believes that silence means harmony, that agreement means respect, but beneath that surface lies a deep well of disconnection. True listening is not passive. It's an act of service. It requires setting aside your own narrative long enough to honor someone else's reality. It means saying, "I see you. I hear you. Your feelings matter." But for the narcissistic husband, this kind of acknowledgement feels like submission. He cannot bear the thought of his wife having emotional authority, of her perspective carrying equal weight. He must always be the one who defines what is real, and in doing so, he builds walls where there should have been bridges. The tragedy is that he craves love and validation as deeply as anyone else, yet his inability to listen makes those things impossible to receive. His world becomes an echo chamber filled only with his own opinions, his own fears, his own projections. And though he might appear powerful, respected, even admired, beneath it all lies a man completely alone, trapped inside the sound of his own voice. He refuses to express gratitude or humility in the relationship because both require the acknowledgement of dependence, and dependence feels intolerable to a narcissistic husband. Gratitude is an admission that someone else has contributed something valuable to your life, that your success, your comfort, your stability in some measure comes from the care and effort of another person. Humility is the recognition that you are not the center of the universe, that your strengths are balanced by weaknesses, and that the people around you deserve acknowledgement for what they bring into your existence. But for the narcissistic husband, these ideas are unbearable. To thank his wife sincerely would be to admit that she gives him something he cannot provide for himself. To show humility would mean lowering the pedestal upon which his fragile ego rests, so he avoids both. He takes what she offers as if it were owed to him, as if kindness, loyalty, and patience were obligations rather than gifts. In daily life, this refusal manifests in subtle but constant ways. She might prepare a meal, offer emotional support, or handle responsibilities that keep their world functioning, yet he meets these acts with indifference or critique. If she seeks acknowledgement, he deflects with sarcasm or irritation, saying things like, "That's your job," or "You're overreacting," or "Why do you always need praise?" In his mind, gratitude diminishes authority. To express it would mean recognizing her contribution, and recognition implies equality. Equality threatens control. So instead, he pretends that everything he receives is the natural order of things, that her efforts are invisible because they are expected. He convinces himself that appreciation is unnecessary, that love should be proven through endurance rather than acknowledged. Humility, too, is foreign to him. A humble man accepts that he can be wrong, that his perspective is limited, and that wisdom often comes from listening. The narcissistic husband, however, equates humility with humiliation. He has built his entire sense of identity on superiority. Smarter, stronger, more rational, more deserving. Admitting fault feels like annihilation, so he maintains an illusion of infallibility. When confronted, he doubles down. When proven wrong, he changes the subject or rewrites the past. He refuses to apologize sincerely because an apology feels like submission. He cannot stand the idea that his wife might possess insight or virtue that he lacks. Even when she shows patience, forgiveness, or strength, he diminishes it, calling it luck or emotional weakness. Anything that threatens his position must be dismissed. The absence of gratitude creates emotional starvation. His wife gives, but her giving disappears into a void. There is no echo of appreciation, die Vertivieren Pentraforder. There is no echo of appreciation, no return of recognition, only the endless expectation that she will continue to serve without acknowledgement. Over time, this erodes her spirit. Gratitude is nourishment. It tells the giver that their efforts matter, that their presence has value. Without it, love begins to feel like labor. The relationship becomes transactional, not tender. She starts to question her worth, wondering why kindness never seems to be enough. The narcissistic husband mistakes her weariness for weakness, not realizing that her exhaustion is the result of his emotional blindness. What makes this dynamic particularly insidious is how he often disguises entitlement as confidence. He tells himself that he deserves what he has because he works hard or because he is the leader of the household. He might even believe that by providing financially or maintaining control, he fulfills his duties, and therefore gratitude should flow only toward him. He cannot see that partnership is reciprocal, that appreciation must travel both ways. In his worldview, admiration is his right, not something earned through humility or compassion. The imbalance becomes the defining feature of the marriage. She gives without acknowledgement, and he receives without awareness. Dense humility would free him from this cycle, but he resists it with everything he has. Humility requires confrontation with the truth that no human being is self-sufficient, that we all depend on the grace and patience of others. The narcissistic husband avoids this realization because it makes him feel small. Yet the refusal to be small makes him emotionally stunted. He stays locked in a posture of superiority, unable to grow, unable to love deeply, because love requires vulnerability. Gratitude and humility open the heart. Pride keeps it closed. His pride is his armor, but it is also his prison. Even in moments when gratitude might naturally arise, when his wife supports him through failure, illness or doubt, he suppresses it. Instead of saying thank you, he acts as if her care is a debt she owed him all along. He interprets compassion as duty, devotion as submission. If she seeks recognition, he accuses her of being needy or manipulative. These accusations deflect from the truth. He fears dependence. To depend on her emotionally would mean she has power over him, and that idea terrifies him. He confuses partnership with vulnerability and vulnerability with danger. But gratitude is not weakness, it is awareness. It is the act of seeing what sustains you. The narcissistic husband cannot bear to see, because seeing would mean realizing how much he takes and how little he gives. His world remains narrow, self-referential, and hollow. He lives surrounded by gifts he cannot acknowledge, supported by love he cannot feel, and blinded by pride he mistakes for strength. Every unspoken thank you builds another wall between him and the person who loves him most. Every moment of withheld humility pushes her further away until he is left in a space where only his ego echoes back to him. He refuses to grow beyond his ego and confront his own insecurities, because doing so would force him to face the aspects of himself he has spent a lifetime avoiding. Growth requires self-reflection, and self-reflection requires courage. The courage to acknowledge your limitations, your failures, and the fears that drive your behavior. For the narcissistic husband, this is unbearable. His ego is a fragile construct, a protective shell built over years of uncertainty and vulnerability. To question it, to challenge it, would feel like dismantling the very identity he relies on to navigate the world. So he resists, not with thoughtfulness, but with denial, defensiveness, and often aggression. He cannot allow himself to see the cracks because he believes that seeing them would make him collapse. And every relationship demands adaptation, and marriage, more than most, requires personal evolution. Life changes, circumstances shift, and people change, but the narcissistic husband remains frozen in the past, anchored to an inflated sense of self that refuses to bend. When his wife asks for growth, for compromise, or for introspection, he perceives it as an attack on his competence and worth. He interprets her desire for mutual growth as criticism, and her requests for understanding as demands that threaten his authority. Instead of engaging with the discomfort, he deflects, manipulates, or stonewalls. By refusing to confront his insecurities, he creates a stagnant environment in which neither partner can flourish. The refusal to confront his own insecurities is rooted in fear. Insecurities are the shadows of the self, the parts we do not want to show, the parts that make us feel inadequate or unworthy.